This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Talk-Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Tonight we're going to talk about the English Manor and family history.
The Talk-Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians. Or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
How are you? It's great that you're there. You know, I've tried this talking to myself in a mirror and it's really not the same. You make all the difference when you're there. So thanks for clicking on this episode of the Talk-Genealogy podcast. How's your family history hunting going? I hope you're getting away from that computer and getting your hands dirty in the graveyards. And I don't want to hear of you taking too much time off either. Although completely different from modern genealogy, medieval genealogy is far more interesting, I think. And even if you decide not to dabble in it, you know, you won't be able to avoid bumping into the odd manor or two. So let's see what's going on and how it can help even your family history. But I want to make it clear that I'm neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you who has spent far too many years digging up his family tree, so often in the wrong place. These podcasts are really me sharing with you the lessons that I've learned along the way. And please remember, I am talking about ancestor hunting in England.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk-Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Apart from the many obvious reasons why the history of the English manor is important to family historians, there is one fundamental root. When you come across the earliest use of your surname, John of Blenkinsop may indicate that he lived in the village of Blenkinsop. It almost certainly does. But they were using the term to indicate the manor to which he belonged, in classes lower than a baron. A bit of self-disclosure here. I wasted 2 years' research before I picked up on the subtlety of that difference. Manorial England knew no parish registers, census returns as we know them, civil registration, enclosure or engrossment. Yes, it was gathering pace and gathering strength, but it was still unusual. This was the world before the dissolution of the monasteries, England's Reformation, and Henry VIII's strengthening of local administration. That means the vestry. In fact, manorial England was before Henry VIII, and that's pretty much sufficient definition. But okay, let's look a little closer. What is an English manor? Well, perhaps it's a system more than anything. It was neither a village nor a parish. I'm particularly interested in one manor that stretched from the outskirts of one village to the outskirts of the next, crossing the parish boundary. It passed through many different hands. One branch of my family took hold of it for one generation and then gave it up the next. Eventually it became an important farm, a horse stud not far from Newmarket Heath, so quite a nice asset to have. And today it's notable for its dovecot. Such are the vagaries of English history. Perhaps it's useful to think of a manor as an estate, but even that is not a rugged comparison. One person might, and often did, hold more than one manor, and not all manors were the same. They had their own idiosyncrasies, but they do have a definite and colourful hold on the tapestry of our history. Now, just to catch up, if your village has a home called the Manor House, it probably isn't. And if there's a manor farm, it probably wasn't. Manor Park, Manor Road, these are usually modern attempts at self-aggrandizement or attempts to appear old world or rural. In my childhood, I once lived on the Manor Park estate, and it certainly wasn't. For the purposes of family history, we may divide these notions of local history into, well, at least 3 periods. The Conquest, or more effectively, Doomsday, with the first period of the manorial system lasting until the Black Death. That was a catastrophic event that meant that the English manor could not be the same afterwards. So we have a later manorial period from, say, the 1380s-ish. These are the years that we need to thoroughly understand. I don't wish to discourage your interest, but that is the case. Thoroughly understand. The next punctuation mark was Henry VIII. So the Reformation in England introduced parish registers, which dominated genealogical research in the modern chapter. Dissolution of the monasteries brought about the redistribution of lands and the acceleration of enclosure, and the authority and powers of the vestry. Put simply, it gave us the parish chest. And so, the manorial years that we need to address are essentially the 15th century, say 1380-ish to the 1530s. The Wars of the Roses, the battles of Agincourt and Bosworth, not quite Shakespeare's Merry England, but getting that way. The manor was held on behalf of the king by the lord of the manor. That lord was not the same as the peerage. It could be, coincidentally, but they did not sit in Parliament because of their lordship of the manor. In return for this asset, the lord of the manor was required to give services to the king, generally military service and money. The lord of the manor could then allow villagers to farm on the open field system and subsist on outlying land in return for labouring on what was called the domain, or the domain land, or the domain farm. Lords of the manor were generally absentee landlords, so the estate was managed by his representative, the steward or the bailiff. The villagers also appointed or elected their own officer, the reeve, who helped to organise the manorial courts. More about them later. There were different classes of the common folk. The main distinction was between the unfree, who could not sell their land or leave, and paid a fine equivalent to a licence before marriage and even on death, or if he wanted to pass the land on to someone else. Free men could do all these things without hinder. Now I'd like to spend just a few minutes on the open field system. That seems a bit of a nonsense because the open field systems, there was more than one in medieval England, deserve a whole episode to themselves, if not a series of podcasts. I am concentrating on the examples in the East Midlands because they are generally taken to be unadulterated and the simplest. When we say that each village operated a 2, 3 or 4 field system, we don't mean that they only had 2, 3 or 4 fields. My ancestors worked in a village where there were 7 fields and employed a 3-field system. From the start, we need to understand that the system was designed to be fair. It was not designed to be efficient. In particular, it was almost impossible to innovate or experiment away from the domain field in the strip system. Tenants, according to their status, worked a number of strips of land across the different fields. Nobody had all their strips in the good field and nobody had all their strips in the bad field. Within one field, the strips of each tenant wouldn't be held together. So nobody was in the good end and nobody was in the bad end. Everybody's field was divided. That was probably one of the most inefficient parts of the system. It was wasted effort going from one to the other, and again, limited innovation. In the same way, when fields were measured, they were measured according to labour and not according to distance. So that a furlong was the amount of ground that an ox could cover before getting tired. It was not about the distance involved. And an acre of land was the amount of land that an ox could work in a day. Again, not about the area. So a furlong would be shorter on difficult ground, longer on easier ground. The intention was to be fair. It was agreed what crops would be sown in each field, and then everybody was expected to comply, and generally speaking, they did. Typically, barley was grown in the first field and wheat in the second, and the third would be left to lie fallow. Wheat and barley were the most important crops, but they could be substituted for rye or even legume crops, though they had a particular agricultural purpose, a discussion for another time. On a yearly basis, that would be rotated. Pasturing could be on common land or on the fallow field. Arrangements for pigs rooting in woodland were very individual across the different manors. All, that means everyone, had to take their corn to the Lord's mill, and as we know, you can tell an honest miller by the hair that grows on the palm of his hand. Now, villeins weren't villains, bad people, but they were those people who farmed as many as 30 different strips of land on the open fields. Obviously, more than one strip per field. Boarders had only a few strips and cotters had none. Perhaps they had a cottage garden or a paddock, but they had to hire out their labour to make ends meet. We need to understand these terms so that the surviving documents make sense. Free, unfree, villain, boarder and cotter. Okay, I'm afraid there's more to come. You know, every month I like to recommend a book, a video and a podcast, and this month's book recommendation is something of a classic. Owen Chadwick, an Anglican priest and at one time a hot tip for the Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a Victorian miniature in 1960, but there are many cheap editions still available, especially on the second-hand market. You won't have any difficulty. At the root of this book were diaries kept by a squire and a vicar in a Norfolk village in Victorian England. It was a subject on which Chadwick would expand in 1983 with his Hensley Henson, a study in the friction between church and state. Chadwick was an established writer. He was co-editor of the Pelican original series, Oxford History of the Christian Church, and it shows. Victorian Miniature is a well-written, informative book, not without a sense of humour. You'll enjoy it, I'm sure. This month's book recommendation is a Victorian Miniature by Owen Chadwick. For the video, wow, I'm really excited about this. Just posted on YouTube in the last couple of days is a short vid, it lasts for just 3 minutes, on the discovery as an original of a 1300 Magna Carta. Now this document is not a discovery in itself. Would you believe it was passed through the hands of a London bookseller in the 1940s? But its status as an original is new. This is a wonderful video. Very exciting, very enthralling, and much come-backable to. And you just search YouTube for Harvard Law Magna Carta copy. Now, the podcast. Last month I recommended the British Association for Local Histories podcast. My word, wouldn't it be crass if I were to recommend it again? But the recent episode is unmissable. It's about how to share local history. And because I'm in charge, yes, I'm going to cite that podcast again for this month's choice. I'm talking about Series 4, Episode 7. You know, I really don't deserve to be editor of the Talk-Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogist with too much time on his hands. But what is it?
Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk-Genealogy podcast.
That's right. That's exactly it.
Hey, Malc, what's coming up?
Well, in the melting pot at the moment is an episode on Bow Bells, the heart of London's Cockney land. It looks like that will be next month's episode. And you know, we ought to do one on the descendants of Edward III before long. You may have noticed that the pods are a little bit out of sync at the moment. You're getting many more than you might expect, but no less than you deserve. And as they say, please do like and subscribe. It makes everything all the more visible.
Malcolm Noble's books on Nottinghamshire history include A Plague in Bleasby. A Nottinghamshire village survives its summer of death. The plague of 1604 reduced the population of Bleasby, Nottinghamshire, by 30%, a demographic deficit that would not recover for 2 generations. Family documents and local records bring detail to this figure, and when placed in the context of broader history, offer an understanding of the village social and economic dynamics. A Plague in Bleasby. A Nottinghamshire village survives its summer of death.
Now, to lend this month's episode a little extra texture, I'm reading from 3 books by Victor Bonham Carter, Adelaide Wortley and Charles Bradford Hall. Here is one extract. The Lord's rights were often modified, in most cases quite wisely, by traditional usage, often stronger in itself than the written law. And though theoretically a villein could be removed from his land and even sold outright with his brood at the caprice of his master, in practice his tenure was often just as stable as that of the Lord himself. More stable, in fact, at the turbulent moments of medieval history. Charles Bradley Ford. The Black Death put an end to this tightly ordered community. The population was reduced by a third. Actually, and I need to be careful here, my own figures, extrapolated from local documents, suggest an even more devastating loss of population. But I'll keep quiet because I am neither a professional nor an expert. With land having run wild and no one to work those pieces of land that did survive in a cultivatable state, with some villages deserted, some churches left to the ducks and geese and goats that needed somewhere to live now that they had been abandoned, the law of economics kicked in. Firstly, the notion of working land in lieu of rent, which had been going out of fashion since the early 1300s, now made no sense at all. So money rents became the regular and usual measure. And secondly, of course, the bargaining position of the labourer improved and he became more mobile. And so the later manorial period presents itself as a far more sophisticated and developed society. Trade did increase pro forca, but largely the manor remained self-contained, if not self-sufficient, and largely self-governing in local affairs. Now, this cooperation was regulated and held to account through the manor courts. There is so much variation in the scheduling of these courts that really it's worth not mentioning the timetable at all. But I suppose most people accept that the court baron was held about monthly and the court leet was held yearly. The court baron addressed the law of tort, T-O-R-T, which survives today, as well as the relationship between the lord and his tenants. The court leet looked at the relationship between the tenants. So it looked at the condition of rivers and roads and paths and ditches. It wanted to know that nobody was encroaching too much on common land and that such landmarks as the boundary stones were properly kept. They looked very seriously at the sanctity of the common land, as well as any abuses when it came to fielding cattle. There was some responsibility for what we would know as weights and measures and the adulteration of food, including beer. They also took a hand in the morals of the village. The manor court met near or inside the church gate, or possibly around the market cross, now demolished. At the court, village officers were appointed. All were unpaid except for the shepherd, an important man, and so busy that he could not be a farmer himself. The following officers were elected: a foreman of the fields, a haywood in charge of the common, a pinder in charge of the pinfield, a hog or swine ringer, a woodward whose job it was to see that not too many trees were felled. Fines imposed by the court were many: 1 sixpenny if thistles were unfelled, another 3 shillings and 4 penny if more horses were on the banks than the number allowed, 2 shillings and 6 pennies for tenting an animal on a field before broke, that is, harvest over, when the church bell rang. Another fine of 5 shillings for having more sheep in the summer than in the winter, and 10 shillings if a stray animal was found on corn, and 1 shilling for tethering more animals than allowed. Adelaide Wortley.
Talk-Genealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and, now and then, a bit of a blog. Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Now this system gave rise to the customs of the manor, which carried much authority and increasing authority. Increasingly, the lords of the manors found themselves unable to tread across these customs. We can see that it gave rise to the common law and the system of precedents that underpin English law today. Each family history will include disputes put to the manor courts. Some examples which I have found include repeatedly the discovery of documents. One party is believed to hold deeds of some description, or perhaps a court judgment, which he refuses to show to the other party. That is the most common complaint tagged on my family tree, and I'm talking about before 1550 here. The interpretation of wills and promises, some simple debt, or the failure to complete work. Evidence recorded on the court proceedings, we'll call them the court roll, contains details of ages, or at least generation gaps, relationships. Beware of an uncle, it does not necessarily mean what you think it might. Property, even in one case, the position of a grave within a churchyard. Now, all of this is crucial history to the genealogist. It is the sort of stuff that can take that important first step beyond parish registers and start your exploration of medieval genealogy. Another useful aspect of the rolls is that they often, though not always, record who was present, or more particularly who was absent. So they are the beginnings of a village register, giving us some indication of size. Now, opinions vary quite a lot on how complete these lists are. One historian says that they may be only 60 or 70% complete, while others say they are very nearly complete. At no other stage of agrarian development has the cultivator been so closely identified with the land, or his life so regulated for its well-being. Charles Bradley Ford. The feudal system, so far as it affected the village, worked well enough for 2.5 centuries, from 1100 to 1350. At best, it offered absolute security and tolerable conditions of life. At its worst, it was rigid and repressive. Indeed, this element of rigidity contributed to its decline, for the system was unable to absorb profound economic change. Victor Bonham Carter. In many cases, the local priory was effectively the lord of the manor. They much abused their position, certainly, but they kept their records in a better state, if only to prove and protect their property rights. Now, let's talk about sources. This is a subject where TNA, the National Archive, really does take centre stage. Its register of surviving manorial documents provides not only a handy directory, but will guide you towards identifying the manors relevant to your families. And that is really the best starting point. TNA will either hold the items themselves, many though not all have been digitized, or they will be able to direct you to the archive which has custody of the documents. Search the special collections of your universities, and the Museum of London's library is going to crop up in your search sooner or later. Those are the three main sources, but they are big ones. Useful links may also be found at the website for the Foundation of Medieval Genealogy and medievalgenealogy.org. Now, let's give you some homework, shall we? Really, if you're going to make use of these sources, you need to have readily at your fingertips the regnal years. Now, a regnal year starts on the anniversary of the king's accession to the throne. Not the 1st of January, not the 25th of March. And of course, it is different for every monarch. Every coronation occurred on a different day of the year, so every series of regnal years also start on a different anniversary. Yes, you can look them up, all right, especially if you Google them. But it's much easier if you have the years to your fingertips. And you will find, actually, that you may not even bother to convert them. Once you understand the regnal year, you can sort of have it in your head, what it means in terms of the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar. And there's no need to go through the process of converting them. So why not do a little bit of upskilling? What an awful word that is, isn't it? A bit of upskilling, and let's learn the regnal years.
Did you catch some of our recent episodes? Episode 49 featured 3 Australian brothers, while episode 48 discussed Admiral Sir John Hawkins. Take Peeps, for example, was episode 30, while number 35 looked at marriage registers and 31 discussed church wardens. Talk-Genealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
I hope that you found this evening's podcast useful. You know, it was Horace Round who said that he could not regard the man who was interested only in his own pedigree as a true genealogist, and it was my growing affection for medieval ancestry that allowed me to finally kick that bothersome boot into touch. I'm fascinated by the intricate detail which these old documents give us into everyday life 1,000 years ago in England. And you can still walk the ground, even as in my case, if you come from a lost village, you can still walk the ground. You know, I once contacted a local historian and asked about the identity of Newbridge, and I was told it was probably a stone bridge on the edge of a field on the northern edge of the parish. It's still there, but it is a wooden bridge and only a footbridge across a dike. And she explained that it was part of a network of paths and farm tracks that formed the main thoroughfare from the village to the local town. The network is still there, we still have a right of way, and we can still walk that network which our forefathers would have regarded as a main route. I hope that tonight's podcast has sparked a bit of your interest in the history of the English manor. It is a very captivating pursuit. My name is Malcolm Noble, and if you've enjoyed tonight's podcast, then you are the genealogist with too much time on your hands.
The Talk Genealogy podcast is posted at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday of each month. Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode and wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night to you, and thanks for listening.